Hey guys, and welcome to the channel and my first jig tying video in my new series titled Bai's Principles. In today's video, we're going to be tying a bucktail preacher jig using all glow and UV materials. We're going to be tying on one of these UV glow Ultra Minnow jig heads by High Caliber Lures. High Caliber Lures is a family-run operation out of Saskatchewan, Canada. Some great people up there, and after checking out their website, I can pretty confidently say you won't find higher quality walleye jigs in Canada and possibly all of North America. I picked up a ton of these jig heads in a variety of colors to experiment with different patterns. And I'll tell you guys, the reviews do not lie. I have a lot of glowing lures, but these by far have the brightest and longest lasting glow of any of the jigs that I own. These are the most popular walleye jig heads in Canada, and they're trusted by a lot of professional walleye anglers. I'll put a link in the description to where you can find these on the High Caliber Lures website. And there's a massive selection of other jig heads and lures that you'll find there that you guys will definitely like. Now for today's jig pattern, we're also going to be using some UV2 bucktail and feathers. And you can find these UV2 materials in a lot of different places, but there is a massive selection in the Caddis fly shop. And I'll put links in the description to those materials and all of the other materials that we're going to be using today. Now we're going to tie all of this in with some Uni Big Fly 360 denier thread. And anytime you're working with bucktail, I'm going to suggest that you use something between 360 and 400 denier. Bucktail fibers are tough and slick, so you have to apply a lot of pressure when you're tying them in, and so it requires a stronger thread. So to get started, we just want to tie a base layer of thread from the base of the collar down the hook shank right to the start of that bend. So the first thing I want to tie in is my feathers. My feathers will make up the tail of the jig, and the tie-in point for our feathers is going to be right there at the start of the bend of the hook. And what I want to do to prepare the feather is just to hold it up and measure how far back I want that tail to go, find the spot on the feather, and I want my tail to be about 1 inch longer than the entirety of the jig head and hook here. So right about there. And once I've established the desired length, I'm just going to peel back the feather right at that point. After that, I'm just going to use gentle pressure here just to strip those fibers, the unwanted ones, off of that quill. And we only need about a 1/2 inch of quill to tie it in, so I'm going to snip the rest of that off just like that. And now I'm going to tie in my first of 2 feathers. I'm just going to be using 2 for my tail, and I'm going to tie it in right there to the side of the shaft. And I'm going to bring my thread right back to that tie-in point so that I can tie in my feather on the opposite side. Now I'm going to bring my thread up about a 1/2 inch or so away from the base of that jig head, and that's going to be my tie-in point for our first layer of bucktail. Now very quickly on the anatomy of a bucktail, up here at the top, at the tip top of the bucktail, we have some longer, wispier fibers that have a lot less flare to them. And then this middle third here of the bucktail has some medium flare, and down here you have your coarse fibers at the base of the hide, and these fibers down here are going to have a lot of flare. We're actually not going to use the fibers down here for the bucktail jig at all. But for this first layer, we want to have a little bit of flare, but not too much, so we're going to be selecting our fibers from roughly about 1/3 of the way down the hide, maybe a little bit less than that, because we do want some flare in our first layer, but we don't want so much flare that it's going to prop up our next layer and give us a super wide, big profile. We want to keep it a little bit sleek. So I'm going to be selecting my first layer of bucktail fibers from right about this section here. You also want to make sure anytime you're working with bucktail and you're removing a clump of hair, you want to cut it as close, as flush to that hide as you possibly can. Even if you're going to trim it up, you want to remove all of that hair. Now I've got my clump removed, and I want to pinch it tightly about 1 inch away from the bottom, and then just use my fingers to pull out any under fur or short fibers that may exist there. After that, we just want to hold it up here and measure out about the length that we're looking for, and then we're going to cut it at that point. Then we're going to hold our clump of bucktail in place, and my first wrap here is going to be a loose wrap, and I'm using my fingers, as you can see the thread rubbing against my fingers, as a guide for where I want that thread to fall. And that first wrap is loose, so that's just a capture wrap. We're just capturing those fibers. We're not going to cinch it down yet because we still need to be able to move these hairs into place before we cinch them down. So I'm going to do another 3 semi-loose wraps here, working up toward the front of that jig head. And after these capture wraps, we can now use our thumb to move those hairs around, and I basically want them moved around to the halfway point of that shank. We can flip it over to the other side here and manipulate that hair just to make sure it's only going halfway on both sides. Once those hairs are in the desired position, our next wrap is now going to be tight. We're going to cinch that down and wrap it up to the front of those hairs. And with these remaining wraps, we're applying constant heavy tension to that bucktail. After we've made tight wraps all the way to the base of that jig head, now I'm going to work it back, retaining that tension all the way to that original tie-in point, just like that. And now I'm just going to apply a quick half hitch just to hold those wraps in place. And with that secured, we can now go ahead and trim up our excess. And I like to use an X-Acto knife. You can use your scissors if you have a nice, precise pair of scissors. Make sure you don't cut your thread. But I just find that the X-Acto knife is pretty precise in getting close to that thread. I feel like I have enough control over it that I'm not going to accidentally snip that thread. Now we're going to complete our first layer by placing some bucktail on the top of the hook here. And we're going to use about the same amount, and we're going to use about the same length, but I'm going to be using green for the top. And I'm also going to take my hairs from the same section of hide that I took my white hairs from. And I'm going to measure it out against that other clump of bucktail and just make sure that they are at the same length. Then I'm going to split it down the middle and hold it in position along the hook. And I'm going to make the same initial loose capture wrap here just to hold that in place. And then 3 more semi-loose wraps heading up toward the jig head. And then I'm just going to use my thumbs like before and just kind of position those bucktail hairs so it's halfway around that hook shank and married up to that white clump of bucktail. And then I'm going to start making my tight wraps just like before. And now, just like before, I'm going to make a half hitch to hold these wraps in place, and I'm going to trim off my excess bucktail here. Now, anytime that I finish securing a layer of bucktail in, I like to add a hardening agent to really secure those wraps. So I'm going to take my thread and move it up out of the way here, just forming a nice base layer of thread around the true collar. And now I'm going to use my Solarez Bone Dry Ultra Thin formula, and this is the absolute best stuff you can use to solidify those wraps. It's really ultra thin, just like described, and it does a fantastic job of soaking into that thread and turning those wraps into one solid piece. So we're just going to use our brush applicator here to apply the resin all the way around these wraps. And once we have that nice even coat, we're just going to hit it with that UV torch to go ahead and lock them in. Now those wraps are definitely not going anywhere. Now, if you're worried about these black threads showing through the bucktail, don't be. I'm going to do something a little bit unique and unconventional to cover that up, so I'm not worried about that at all. But right now, with my thread positioned at the back of the collar here, I'm going to go ahead and add in my second layer of bucktail. And for this layer, I'm going to be using the hairs at the very tip top of that bucktail. And from this section, I'm going to be selecting the longest hairs that I can find, and this is going to be our thickest clump that we use. In fact, this clump is going to be roughly about 50% more dense than the first clump that we put in. And now I'm going to measure up this layer so that it ends about a ½ inch from where our first layer of bucktail ends, right about there. And then we're going to tie that layer in, just like before. Put in a half hitch to hold that in place. And now once again, I'm going to trim up that excess. And now I'm going to do the same exact thing with my green bucktail right on the top. But I'm actually going to make my top layer slightly less dense than the one we just tied in, and I'll show you why right after we're finished tying it in. So now we're going to measure this out the same length as we did before. And now we'll split that hook just like before and tie in our next green layer. Now I'll do another half hitch just to secure that, and then we'll go ahead and trim off our excess once again. Now the reason that we made this clump a little bit less dense than our bottom clump of bucktail is because we're actually going to tie some more bucktail on the very top of our jig. And it's going to be purple. That's right, we are going to tie a darker color on the very top of our jig. And just like most of the baitfish imitation lures out there, like the jerk baits and crankbaits, they typically will have a dark stripe across the top of the back. Fish typically will be darker along their back. It helps them blend in with the bottom when the predators are above them. And they'll typically be lighter on the underside, and that helps them blend in with the bright surface of the water when predators are ambushing from below. So now I'm just going to grab a touch of those longer, wispier purple fibers, and we're going to tie them in right along the top of that jig. All right, here's our nice, long and lean, less dense clump of purple bucktail. And we are not going to trim this down at all. I want it to travel along as much of that body as we can. And I'm not going to spread this around either. I'm going to try to keep it right on top of that jig on the very top of the back. Now we are not finished quite yet, but I am going to perform 5 whip finish turns now and just lock these threads in place. Go ahead and reset my jig here. Now I can snip my thread here. And now we'll apply some more of our Solarez Bone Dry to lock those threads in place. And with those wraps secured, I am now actually going to remove our jig from the vise. And now I'm going to take a black fabric marker, and what I'm going to do is color stripes in down the body. I'm going to make this resemble sort of a perch pattern with about 3 vertical stripes that taper toward the bottom. Alright, here is what we have now that I've added my stripes. As you can see, we've got a perch-like pattern going on. Same thing on the other side over here, and I think that is looking pretty sexy. Now, since we have the jig out of the vise currently, I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the profile of this jig. As you can see from the side here, our profile right now fans out at about a 30-degree angle. But as you're jigging this thing through the water is going to push those outermost hairs in. And since we put our most flexible hairs on the outermost layers, what you end up with, if you look here, is a very accurate baitfish profile. And if you look at the jig from the top, it's a lot more narrow. We're not fanning out at that 30-degree angle. It's more like a 10-degree angle. And when this thing is being pulled through the water, it is also going to slim down and create a super accurate baitfish profile from the top. So by vertically stacking our hairs and using the correct bucktail in the correct places, we have created that 3-dimensional perfect baitfish profile. Now let's get this thing back in the vise because we're not done yet and we're going to make it even cooler. So from the beginning, I wanted this jig to be completely made out of glow and UV materials. But right now we have this collar of black thread that is not UV reactive. And we are about to fix that with some 210 denier Danville's fluorescent green thread. And with this thread, we're going to build up a new collar, but we're also going to tie in some UV flash and some UV2 accent feathers that are really going to make this thing stand out. So right now we'll just get our new thread started on that collar. And my black collar was a little bit uneven, so I'm trying not to build up in areas where it's already a little bit too thick. So now I'm going to take 3 strands of this UV flash doubled over, and I'm going to tie it in right here along that line where the purple and green meet along the back there. I'm not really worried about creating a lateral line here. If you look at a picture of a perch, they don't have a super pronounced lateral line, but instead we're going to add that flash on the sides along the top there. That way the predators can see that flash from above, and also when we jerk this thing up off the bottom, any predators that are following our jig are going to get a face full of that flash as this thing goes nose up. So I'm just going to double my flash over that thread, get it into the position that I want, and we're just going to tie that in. Once we have those tied in, I'm going to trim that right at the end of some of my longer bucktail fibers. And then I'm going to come back in with some scissors and just shorten up about half of those pieces of flash. And that's going to help it just be not as blocky and make it taper out a little bit at the end. Now I'm just going to do the same exact thing on the other side. Now that we have our flash tied in on both sides, I am now going to add some chartreuse marabou feather as an accent on the sides, almost mimicking like a pectoral fin. And that'll give us some additional movement in the water as well. But first I'm going to cover up all of the black thread in the back half of this collar. So now I'm just going to prepare my marabou feather by sliding my fingers along the sides all the way up to the top until I have a clump that's only about 3/4 of an inch in length. And then we're going to position that on the collar about halfway up right there on the side of the jig. And we're going to secure that in place. After about 4 or 5 good wraps, I'm just going to twist up the feather and I'm going to cut that right up against those wraps. And then we're going to wrap back on that, just making sure we have it nice and secure. And now we're going to flip over to the other side and do the exact same thing. Now I'm just going to finish covering up any exposed marabou through that collar and any black thread as well. And now that we're all finished up here, I'm going to whip finish 5 times, and we're going to go ahead and seal this up with some more of that Solarez bone dry. Now right here, I do want to make sure that I avoid getting my bone dry on those marabou feathers. Go ahead and hit that with the UV torch. And voila, would you look at this thing now. And this thing is just looking great. But take a look here at what we added to that top-down profile. You can see those protruding pectoral fins from the side. And when we jig this thing through the water, it will pull that marabou back, and then on the pause, it will fan out again in the water, just like the pectoral fins of a real bait fish. And check this out, guys. With those UV-reactive materials, we are putting on an absolute light show. And here's the other side. That is looking crazy. Now my camera is not super good at picking up the UV reaction, but you guys can see enough, I think. That looks absolutely fantastic. Very highly visible. And I guarantee you I can get a lake trout or a walleye to smash this thing. And there's another look at the high caliber lures Ultra Minnow UV glow jig head. Alright guys, that is going to do it for today's video, and I hope you did find some value in it. Now I'm not big on disclaimers, but this is actually my 3rd bucktail jig I have ever tied in my life. That being said, I'm really happy with the way this thing turned out. I have no doubt that it's going to get smashed, and there is definitely a lot of room for improvement, especially with the smoothness and the speed of my tying. But for right now, I'm just focused on quality, and I think this turned out pretty dang well. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about the marabou pectoral fins. There are a lot of people out there tying tails with marabou, but pectoral fins is actually something I have not seen before. And I like doing weird, creative, original stuff, which is why I got into this in the first place. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I have a lot more tying videos coming, a lot more original jig and fly patterns, as well as a plethora of other fishing content if that's your cup of tea. Hope you guys have a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next video.